Odessa, 19th September 1943. The cold air inside the captured hangar smelled of oil, metal, and dust. It was quiet, except for the echoing steps of German boots on the concrete floor. The B-17 Flying Fortress stood in the center like a giant beast, its wings stretched wide, its engines still as stone. It had crash-landed in occupied France just days before, mostly intact. The Luftwaffe had ordered it be brought in for full inspection. The Allies called it a flying fortress. The Germans wanted to know why. 4 German engineers arrived early that morning, sharp at 0700 hours. Oberingenieur Klaus Weber led them, tall, silent, always carrying a small leather notebook. With him were Dieter, the youngest, full of questions, Franz, who rarely spoke, and old Heinrich, who'd fixed more planes than he could count. They stood around the B-17 in silence for a long moment. The machine was bigger than anything they were used to, not just in size, but in presence. Bullet holes lined its wings and fuselage, yet it had landed in one piece. That puzzled Klaus. "We start with the fuselage," he finally said, flipping open his notebook. 2 ladders were pulled close, and the crew began unscrewing panels. Bit by bit, the guts of the plane were revealed. Miles of wires, strange configurations, dense armor in places they never expected. Dieter kept taking notes, muttering, "Warum here?" "Why here?" He pointed at thick armor plates along the cockpit and around the fuel lines. "This isn't random." Franz slid his fingers across the metal and nodded. "This isn't just strong, it's planned." By noon, they had pulled off much of the outer shell. What they found underneath made Klaus frown. The armor wasn't covering the most damaged parts of the plane, like the wings or the tail. Instead, it protected areas that were barely ever hit, or so it seemed. Heinrich lit a cigarette, leaning back on a crate. "Strange way to armor a warbird," he said. "Not how we'd do it." "No," Klaus said slowly, rubbing his chin. "It's how we wouldn't do it. But perhaps that's the point." They sat around a wooden table with diagrams of the plane laid out. Klaus drew a rough outline, marking all the places where the armor was installed. Dieter marked the areas most often hit in battle, data they had gathered from past air raids. "See here," Klaus said, pointing. "They didn't reinforce the places that take the most damage. They reinforced the ones that didn't. That makes no sense," Franz said. Klaus's voice dropped. "It makes perfect sense. If planes are coming back with holes in the wings and tails, that means those hits don't stop them from returning. The planes that get hit in the cockpit or fuel lines never come back." Dieter's eyes widened. "So they studied the planes that survived, not the ones that were lost. They armored the missing data," Klaus said almost in a whisper. The hangar fell quiet. In that moment, they realized they weren't just dealing with American steel. This was strategy. This was logic. This was mathematics turned into armor. The rest of the day, they studied the patterns, trying to break them. But every time they looked, it led them back to the same conclusion. The Americans weren't just building strong planes. They were making decisions based on numbers. Cold, smart numbers? "It's not luck that brings them home," Heinrich finally said. "It's equations." That night, Klaus sat alone beside the B-17, looking up at the bullet holes like stars on metal skin. He opened his notebook and wrote just one sentence. "This plane is armored with knowledge, not steel." He closed the book and lit a match, watching the flame dance before going out in the silence. Date: 20th of September, 1943. The next morning came with the clang of the heavy hangar doors sliding open, letting in the grey light of a drizzling sky. Klaus was already awake. He hadn't slept much. His thoughts had churned all night, filled with formulas and fire, with war machines and quiet logic. He looked at the B-17 again, but not as an enemy aircraft now, more like a puzzle from a higher mind. The others arrived just behind him, their boots echoing against the concrete. Dieter looked tired but eager. "I've been thinking," he said, unrolling a piece of paper. "If the Americans are using this method, armoring what we don't see, then what else are they hiding in plain sight?" Klaus raised an eyebrow. "You believe this goes beyond armor?" "I do," Dieter said. "Maybe in how the fuel flows, or the communication system, maybe even their flight strategy. They aren't just flying these things, they're testing them like scientists." Franz, silent as always, was already pulling off another panel from the wing. What he found made everyone pause. A strange copper network was lined just behind the frame, carefully laid out in tight, purposeful loops. "This isn't structural," Franz muttered. "It's not even electrical." "What is this?" Klaus examined it closely. It reminded him of something he'd seen once in a scientific journal. Wave dampeners, the kind used to reduce vibrations or signal noise. But that was theoretical, experimental. "This doesn't belong in a warplane," Heinrich said, scratching his head. "It does," Klaus replied, "if you're designing a machine to outlast physics." That sentence hung in the air like smoke. By midday, they had unearthed more. Insulated cables, unlike anything in German models, strange black boxes with markings in coded serials, small compartments built for no obvious purpose. One was filled with a thick, rubbery gel. Dieter dipped a tool into it, then watched it bounce slightly like jelly. "What is this?" he asked, confused. "To absorb shock," Klaus guessed. "Maybe to protect the crew or vital components." Franz shook his head. "This is over-engineered. It's too much." "No," Klaus said. "It's precise. Not too much. Just enough." They were no longer reverse engineering a plane. They were dissecting a thought process. As the afternoon sun crept across the hangar's high windows, Klaus walked slowly around the B-17, his hand trailing along the smooth metal skin. He began to see it all like a system, not just bolts and beams, but balance, a network of intentions. He started drawing again in his notebook, sketching out what he called decision webs, chains of thought that must have gone into each placement, each protection layer. That's when Dieter said something that made the entire room still. "This wasn't built by generals." Klaus looked up. "This wasn't designed by soldiers. It was made by mathematicians, statisticians, scientists who never even touched the battlefield. They're fighting us with people who don't carry guns." Heinrich scoffed. "You think men with glasses and chalkboards will win a war?" Dieter didn't smile. "They already are." Klaus didn't say anything, but he knew Dieter was right. He walked to the cockpit and sat in the pilot's seat, staring at the dials, the levers, the geometry of it all. Everything had a reason. Everything had been measured. Even the seat was placed to maximize visibility without compromising armor. He leaned back and exhaled. "We've underestimated them." That evening a car arrived outside the hangar. It was black, polished and silent. A high-ranking Luftwaffe officer stepped out, General Müller, known for his cold eyes and sharp tongue. He walked in without speaking and surveyed the scene. The engineers stood straight, nervous. "Well?" he asked. Klaus stepped forward. "It's not just the plane, Herr General. It's the thinking behind it. They are building aircraft with minds that think like machines." Müller raised a brow. "Meaning?" Klaus took a breath. "Meaning we cannot simply copy it. We cannot match it by building stronger steel or faster engines. We must think as they do, coldly, logically, with data, not emotion." The general said nothing. Then, after a pause, he nodded once and turned to leave. Klaus knew he had heard him. Whether it would change anything, he didn't know. Later that night, the team sat around a small stove, sipping from tin cups. Rain pattered softly on the hangar roof. The B-17 loomed behind them like a ghost of future wars. "We're not fighting men anymore," Dieter said quietly. "We're fighting their ideas." And Klaus, staring into the flames, simply replied, "Then we better start thinking." Because deep inside, he knew the truth. Steel could be bent, fuel could be burned, but ideas? Ideas could win wars. Date: 21st September, 1943. The rain hadn't stopped since midnight. It tapped steadily against the high glass panels of the hangar, and the light coming through was dull and grey. But inside, the German engineers were already deep in work. Something had changed among them, not just in their tone, but in their purpose. They weren't just inspecting the B-17 anymore. They were chasing the mind of whoever built it. Klaus stood over a large blueprint table, piecing together sketches and pages torn from technical manuals. Every note they had made over the last 2 days was laid out: armor placement, wiring maps, unusual design choices. He was trying to reconstruct the logic, not of the plane, but of the people behind it. "They didn't think like us," he muttered. "They thought in outcomes." Dieter, standing nearby, nodded. "They didn't protect everything. They protected what mattered most to survival. It's ruthless and brilliant." Franz had been quiet all morning, but now he spoke. "You know what's bothering me?" he said. "The way the armor is placed, not on engines, not on wings, just the cockpit, fuel system, and sometimes the belly. They expected everything else to get hit, and they accepted that." Klaus glanced up. "They let soldiers die if it meant the plane could return." There was a long silence. "They're using numbers like a weapon," Dieter said slowly. "Choosing survival over comfort, strategy over feeling. If you were a gunner in this plane, they wouldn't protect you. You're not essential. The pilot is." "That's war," Franz muttered. "No," Klaus said, his voice low. "That's mathematical war." Just then a loud metallic clang echoed across the hangar. Heinrich had accidentally knocked over a toolbox, but something underneath it caught his eye. A sealed compartment in the plane's belly, so subtle it almost blended in with the rest of the frame. "Get the crowbar," Heinrich said. It took a few minutes, but they finally forced it open. Inside was a metal case, stamped with US Army markings, sealed tightly. Klaus opened it slowly. Inside were thin sheets, documents, flight logs, and folded diagrams. But among them was something stranger. A worn leather notebook filled with equations, charts, and strange symbols. The name on the inside cover read, "Lilte Charles H. Emerson, Operations Analyst." "Who brings a math book into war?" Dieter whispered. They sat in silence as Klaus turned the pages. It wasn't just math, it was decision theory, survival probabilities, damage estimates, notes like tail hits, survivable, engine hits, temporary, cockpit hits, as fatal. Probability of return with left-wing damage, 78%. No action required. Recommendation, shift armor to crew vital zones only. Franz leaned in. "This man, he studied death like it was a machine." Dieter's hands trembled slightly. "He's not a pilot, he's not a soldier, he's a statistician." Klaus nodded. "And he might be the most dangerous man in this war." They read more. In the margins of one page, Emerson had scribbled something in shaky handwriting. "Protect what brings the bird home. The rest can be replaced." No poetry, no emotion, just logic. They were no longer looking at a war machine. They were staring at the result of cold arithmetic, at survival calculated to the decimal. It was unnerving. Heinrich finally spoke. "If they start building all their planes like this, we'll lose the skies." "No," Klaus said, his voice almost a whisper. "We'll lose the war." For a moment, no one moved. Then Dieter asked, "So what do we do?" Klaus stared at the open notebook. The rain kept falling behind them. "We don't copy the plane," he said. "We copy him. Whoever this Emerson is, he's worth more than 100 bombers." Franz scoffed. "You want us to think like Americans now?" Klaus looked him in the eye. "No, I want us to think like mathematicians." That night, Klaus stayed in the hangar long after the others left. He sat beneath the bomber, reading the notebook again by the light of a single bulb. He could feel the ghost of Emerson in every number, every margin note. A man who had probably never seen a bullet fly, yet who might have turned the tide of the entire air war. And Klaus understood something terrifying. The Americans weren't just throwing metal into the sky, they were throwing ideas, and behind every idea was someone who had done the math. Date: 22nd September 1943. The morning arrived without sunlight. The clouds still hung heavy over the airfield like a blanket of smoke. Inside the hangar, the silence wasn't just from the weather. It was from something else now, a kind of quiet tension, as if they were touching something far greater than they'd expected. Klaus sat at the long work table, the American notebook open in front of him. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't shaved. His eyes were red from reading all night, but his mind had never been sharper. Every number in that notebook spoke a truth they had never considered. This wasn't about firepower. This was about survivability. Dieter came in first, still buttoning his uniform. "I can't stop thinking about it," he said without even saying hello. "All those flights, all that data, they weren't just flying missions. They were running experiments." "Yes," Klaus said, not looking up, "and we were playing checkers while they were playing chess." He tapped the page. "They didn't just armor this plane with steel, they armored it with statistics." Franz arrived next, with a piece of the wing he'd taken back to clean. "I measured the plating again," he said. "It's not uniform. The thickness changes in different sections, just by millimeters, but it's intentional." He put the piece on the table with a loud thud. Klaus looked at it, then he looked back at the notebook. Every decision on this aircraft was based on calculated odds. If they found out one section had a 5% higher chance of fatal damage, they adjusted for it. Every inch matters. Dieter leaned over the notebook again, pointing to a graph Emerson had drawn. "Look at this. It's a probability curve for mid-air failures. It's not perfect, but it's close. He even accounts for morale loss when planes go down." He understood that fear was also a weapon. That stunned them all for a moment. They hadn't even thought of that. Fear wasn't something they charted, but the Americans were quantifying it. Heinrich finally joined them, holding a mug of hot black coffee. "So what now?" he asked. "We give this to Berlin and let them laugh at us for thinking a chalkboard is more dangerous than a bomber?" Klaus shook his head. "Berlin doesn't need this. They won't understand it." Franz raised an eyebrow. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying we don't just report what we found. We build something with it." The others went quiet. Klaus stood up, walking over to the blackboard on the far side of the hangar. He picked up a piece of chalk and began writing equations. Slowly, carefully. "We start with our own planes," he said. "We gather every damage report from the past 6 months. Every fighter, every bomber that came back or didn't." He underlined the word, survivors. "We mark where they were hit, which ones made it home, which ones didn't. We run the numbers. We identify the patterns, just like Emerson did." Dieter watched with wide eyes. "You want to turn our entire Air Force into a math problem?" Klaus turned to him, eyes cold with purpose. "I want to stop guessing. I want to stop building aircraft the way we think they should be built. I want to build them the way they need to be built." He paused, then said slowly, "Built for survival, not glory." There was a long silence. Then Franz said quietly, "That's not how the Reich thinks." Klaus nodded. "Then the Reich will lose." The rest of the day, they began pulling damage reports from locked cabinets, old files, any source they could find. Heinrich made calls to other airfields, requesting access to downed aircraft logs. Dieter began organizing data on a massive board, plotting entry and exit wounds from flak and bullets. Klaus started building probability charts, drawing curves with pencil and ruler, slowly creating what he called a survival map. By nightfall, the hangar floor was covered with papers, diagrams and chalk markings. The B-17 sat in the background like a silent mentor, wounded but unbroken. As the engineers sat around it, Klaus finally closed the notebook they had taken from Emerson. "Do you know what scares me the most?" he said softly. "Not the bombs, not the guns." He looked around at them all. "It's that they're thinking faster than we are." "Today," and as the cold wind blew through the open cracks in the hangar door, none of them said a word, because deep down they all knew the war was changing. And it wasn't about muscle anymore. It was about the mind. Date, 23rd September 1943. The fourth day began with the same grey sky, the same cold air inside the hangar. But something had shifted. It was no longer just an investigation. It was a race. Klaus stood in the center of the hangar with chalk dust on his sleeves, the back of his hand stained with graphite. He hadn't slept again. A crude but growing map of numbers, probability charts, damage patterns and armor placements now filled an entire wall of the hangar. It looked like madness until you stepped closer. Then it looked like war. He had spent the night calculating. The others arrived in silence. Dieter stared at the wall, eyes scanning over red circles drawn on diagrams of various aircraft. The Heinkel 111, the Junkers Ju-88, even the Messerschmitt fighters. Beside them were annotations in Klaus's handwriting. Tail damage, survivable. Fuel cell puncture, 76% fatal. Engine flame-out survivability, low, unless single hit. Mein Gott, Dieter muttered. We've been armoring the wings. Yes, Klaus said from behind him, his voice hoarse. Because they're always shot, but not always fatal, Dieter finished. Exactly. Heinrich stepped closer, rubbing his chin. So the reason those American bombers make it home isn't luck. No, Klaus said. It's because they accepted loss and focused on what mattered. The phrase settled on them like a heavy weight. Franz pointed to one of Klaus's scribbled charts. This curve here, what is this? It's a fatality prediction model. I've been using our own Luftwaffe data, over 200 missions. I had to make assumptions, but the trend is clear. He stepped up to the wall, tapping the chart. Planes that were hit in the wings or tail could limp home. Pilots survived. But those hit in the forward fuselage or fuel tanks never made it back. And yet we put our thickest armor on the wings and rear stabilizers, because that's where we saw the damage, Dieter said, realization blooming on his face. But we never saw the ones that didn't come home, Klaus said quietly. So we never learned from the silence. It was a terrible kind of genius, the idea that absence told a story louder than presence. Dieter shook his head. Why didn't we see this before? Because we weren't looking, Klaus replied. Because we trusted tradition. We trusted our instincts. And they, he pointed back to the American notebook, trusted data. There was a pause before Heinrich said, Berlin won't believe any of this. They won't need to, Klaus replied. Because we're not sending them this. Franz turned, confused. You're keeping this from command? Klaus didn't flinch. Yes, he looked at each of them one by one. If this knowledge goes straight to the high command, it will be buried or misused. They'll slap more armor onto planes without understanding why, and they'll get more pilots killed. So what do you suggest? Heinrich asked, skeptical. We prove it, Klaus said. In the field, quietly. Franz folded his arms. With what? One prototype? We're engineers, Klaus, not generals. I don't need a general, Klaus said. I need a mechanic who can follow instructions, a crew that doesn't ask questions, and a bomber we can modify. Dieter's eyes lit up. We can test it. One mission, a modified bomber with smart armor. If it survives something that should have killed it, then we have proof, Klaus said. And maybe, he added softly, we can save lives. The next few hours were spent in feverish planning. They picked a Junkers Ju-88, slated for scrapping due to a damaged wing. It would be repaired and modified in secret. Klaus began sketching a new armor layout, thin where it could be, reinforced only around the cockpit, fuel lines, hydraulic system, and communications bay. We give it speed back, Klaus said. Less weight, more precision, no unnecessary plating. By afternoon, the hangar was a storm of movement. Heinrich retrieved parts. Franz and Dieter began cutting the old armor plating. Klaus kept checking the charts, cross-referencing damage maps with flight logs, refining every decision. They worked without rest, their hands grimy with sweat and metal dust. And all the while, the captured B-17 stood quietly in the background, its bullet-riddled body still speaking in numbers and silence. That evening, as they sat around a small oil heater, Dieter finally asked, "Do you think Emerson knew what he was doing would change the war?" Klaus stared at the flickering flame. "I think he knew exactly what he was doing," he said. "He wasn't building machines. He was building survivors." And then he whispered to himself, almost too soft to hear, "We've been building martyrs." No one answered, because they all knew he was right. Date, 24th September 1943. The rain finally stopped, but the skies remained the color of gunmetal. The hangar floor was now a mess of stripped armor panels, schematics drawn in chalk, grease-streaked paper, and rivet dust. A war was happening outside. But inside, another war was being waged, quiet, precise, fought with pencils, calipers, and numbers. The Junkers Ju-88 lay in the center now, its skeleton exposed. Klaus had pulled most of the standard armor off. At first glance, it looked like sabotage. But anyone watching closely would see that each removed piece had been replaced, strategically, with lighter plating, restructured supports, or left unarmored entirely. Dieter knelt beside the forward fuselage, carefully welding a curved panel into place around the cockpit. It wasn't thicker, it was smarter, angled to deflect incoming fire, just like the American design. He paused, sweat dripping from his brow. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No armor on the wing roots? That's suicide if they take a direct hit." Klaus was above, inside the cockpit, adjusting the reinforced control rods. "They've taken hits before and made it back. I'd rather bet on that than weigh the plane down and lose altitude under fire." Franz walked in with a set of rubber dampeners, holding them like they were gold. "Stole these from the mechanics bay. Closest thing we have to that American shock gel," Heinrich grunted. "You're going to get us all court-martialed." Klaus looked down at him. "Then let it be for something that worked." By midday, the Ju-88 had been completely transformed. Not in appearance, but in soul. It wasn't heavier, it was leaner. Not safer, just cleverer. Its protection was not a shell, but a shield formed by understanding where death was most likely to strike. And more importantly, where it wasn't. Klaus stepped back and looked at the machine. It was still German steel, but now it had something new inside it. American logic. "Now," he said, "we test it." The plan was simple and dangerous. There was a bombing run scheduled the next morning over the British-held section of the French coast. High risk, heavy flak. That's what they wanted. "Send the Ju-88 with the others," Klaus had told the base commander. "Just a final test before we scrap her." "Calibration flight." The commander barely looked up. "Fine, just make sure she comes back. Or don't." That night, Klaus found himself alone again in the hangar, staring at the American notebook. He turned to the last page. Emerson's handwriting was smaller now, almost cramped. The ink smudged from what might have been sweat or blood. "We don't win wars by surviving. We win them by knowing why others don't." The line sent a chill down his spine. He closed the notebook, slid it into a hidden compartment under the tool bench, and turned out the light. Duduten, 25th of September, 1943, Mission Day. The airstrip roared to life before dawn. Engines coughed smoke. Men shouted over the metallic clatter of bombers being loaded and fueled. The Ju-88, nicknamed Die Beobachterin, the observer, sat at the end of the row, quietly waiting. Its pilot was a calm young officer named Oberleutnant Riedel. He had no idea what had been done to his aircraft. "Why is she so light?" he asked, as he climbed in. "Test adjustments," Klaus said with a forced smile. "New armor configurations." "You'll thank us later," Riedel laughed. "If I'm alive to say it." Then he took off, vanishing into the low sky with the rest of the formation. The engineers waited in silence. The hours passed slowly. They didn't speak much. Dieter smoked. Heinrich paced. Franz stared out at nothing. Klaus just sat at the edge of the hangar, eyes fixed on the clouds. One bomber returned, then another, then three more. Some were riddled with holes. One landed on fire. Another crash-landed short of the runway. But then they saw her. The Ju-88, the observer. She came in fast, gliding low. A few bullet holes along her tail. One broken radio antenna. But her engines were smooth, her landing steady. Riedel climbed out, shaking his head. "That was hell up there," he said. "Flak everywhere. We lost two. Took a round through the wing. Thought we were done." He looked back at the plane. But she handled like a dream. Took hits and kept going. It's like she knew what to avoid. Klaus just nodded. No celebration, no smiles. Just quiet confirmation. Inside the hangar that night, Klaus picked up the chalk again and wrote 2 words on the board, large and clear. It works. The others stood behind him, reading it, but not saying anything. Because now everything had changed. Not just what they were building, but why. Date, 26 September 1943. The morning after the mission felt different. For the first time in weeks, the hangar wasn't filled with frustration or confusion. It was filled with a quiet electricity, an unspoken realization that they'd seen something rare, something dangerous, proof the Ju-88 had flown into hell and come back almost untouched. Not because it was stronger, but because it had been built with precision, with intention. Every decision made had been based on cold, brutal logic. Armor where it mattered, nowhere else. The others had always followed Klaus's lead, but now they believed him. Dieter arrived with a bundle of mission reports in his arms. I compared the damage logs, he said, slapping them down on the table. Our modified Ju-88 took fewer hits overall than the others. Klaus looked up from his notebook. That makes sense. No, I mean statistically fewer. It wasn't luck. She flew like she was built to avoid death. Like she was smarter, Franz nodded. I checked her weight against the standard model. She's lighter by nearly 400 kilograms. Higher climb rate. Better maneuvering. We gave her the best chance. Heinrich, who had been the most skeptical from the start, just stood in the corner, arms folded. Finally he spoke. So it works, Klaus turned. Yes, Heinrich exhaled, almost a laugh. Then what the hell do we do now? That question hung in the air longer than it should have, because the truth was, they didn't know. They had proven something extraordinary, but this wasn't something they could just walk into Berlin and present with a bow. The military didn't like new ideas, especially not ones that sounded like surrendering to mathematics. They won't accept this, Franz said. Not from us. Not from anyone. Not unless we show them what it means, Klaus replied. He stood, pacing slowly. One plane returning from one mission. That's a story. But a fleet of them. That's undeniable. Dieter leaned forward. You want to rebuild an entire squadron? Klaus nodded. Yes, in secret if we have to, bit by bit. Quiet changes. Redesigns hidden under routine repairs. We don't tell them what we're doing. We just make the planes better. Heinrich scratched his chin. And when they notice, then we give them results so undeniable they won't care how we did it. And so began the next phase. Not one of discovery, but of quiet rebellion. Over the following week, they worked like ghosts in the night. Under the pretense of standard maintenance, they altered every bomber they could get their hands on. They rerouted hydraulic lines away from exposed sections, reinforced cockpit walls with angled plating stolen from scrapyards, shifted fuel lines deeper inside fuselages, removed heavy wing armor, and redistributed the weight to where it actually mattered. They began calling their hidden project Schattenhaut, shadow skin, because that's what it was. Invisible armor, built not of steel but of understanding. Other mechanics noticed the changes, of course. Some asked questions. Most didn't. A few raised eyebrows when bombers started coming back from deadly runs in better shape than expected. But in war, miracles are accepted before they're explained. Dieter compiled data on every mission, hit patterns, return rates, flight times. The numbers kept proving the same truth. The shadow skin was saving lives. More than that, it was outsmarting death. And still, no one in command knew. One night, as the 4 of them sat in the hangar, eating cold bread and stale coffee, Klaus looked around at the modified planes. We're changing the war, he said. Franz looked doubtful. Maybe our corner of it. That's how it starts, Dieter added. You think the Americans had generals backing Emerson from the start? I think he was just a man with numbers, who wouldn't shut up. Heinrich chuckled. Well, we're following his ghost. No, Klaus said quietly, eyes steady. We're answering him. Outside, another bomber landed. Its nose blackened, holes punched through the tail, but its crew alive. That made 5 in a row. No one said anything. They didn't need to. Later that night, Klaus stood alone in the hangar, staring once more at the captured B-17. He ran his hand along its riddled side. It had become something more than a machine to him. It was a message, left by minds who understood war differently, not as a matter of strength, but of survival, of endurance, of knowing where not to stand when the fire came. He placed his hand flat against the cold steel. "We understand now," he whispered. "We see what you were trying to say." And in the silence that followed, it almost felt like the plane had whispered back. Date: 27th September 1943. The sun rose in shards through the high windows of the hangar. Outside, the war kept grinding on. Bombers roared overhead, trucks moved along muddy roads, and distant gunfire echoed like thunder. But inside the walls of Hangar 6, something else had begun to take shape. Not just planes, a quiet revolution. By now, Schattenhaut had been applied to 6 operational bombers. They didn't all return from every mission untouched, but they were surviving longer, taking smarter damage, giving crews the vital minutes needed to limp home rather than vanish into fire. It was working. But that morning, the bubble cracked. Heinrich came in first, face pale, cap in his hand. "There's a problem," he said, voice low. Klaus looked up from a chart he was drafting. "What kind of problem?" "Gestapo," Heinrich replied. They were seen speaking with the base commander. "Asking questions." Dieter froze mid-step. "About what?" "About us." A heavy silence dropped like lead. Franz swore under his breath. "Too many questions. Too many change designs. Someone noticed." Klaus exhaled slowly, thinking. "Then we go quiet. No more modifications for now. We don't change another bolt unless it's officially ordered." Dieter shook his head. "It's too late. We're on a list now. Then we finish what we started before they shut us down," Klaus said sharply. "No more hiding. We write it all down. All of it, the data, the patterns, the equations, everything we've learned." "We already have that," Franz said, pointing to the chalkboard. Klaus walked over and wiped it clean. "No," he said. "We write it for someone who doesn't already believe. Something they can't ignore. A paper, a doctrine. With charts, proof, real examples. Something that even a blind bureaucrat can't argue with." They worked through the day and then the night. Every mission was logged. Every plane was sketched. Damage reports were overlaid with survival rates. Equations were refined. Arguments were structured. It wasn't enough to be right. They had to prove they were right. Klaus titled the document simply, "The Silent Shield," a study on predictive armor placement based on survivorship patterns. It was 23 pages, precise, cold, unemotional, and devastating. Date: 28th of September, 1943. The knock came early. 3 men, 2 in Luftwaffe uniforms, 1 in the long black coat of the Gestapo. The engineers were gathered around the table, going over the final draft of the Silent Shield. Klaus didn't flinch when the door opened. He tucked the papers into a metal folder and calmly turned to face them. The man in the coat was younger than expected, pale, sharp-featured, with eyes that flicked from face to face like a hawk scanning for weakness. "I am Officer Reinhardt," he said. "We've been receiving reports of unauthorized modifications to Luftwaffe aircraft under your supervision." Franz stood. "We were only making efficiency adjustments. Nothing more." Reinhardt stepped forward. "Adjustments without clearance, patterns of unsanctioned behavior, and strange statistical records being compiled without a request from High Command." He turned to Klaus. "And you must be Oberingenieur Weber, the one they say has been building planes based on American logic." Klaus didn't blink. "No, sir. I've been building them based on German losses." Reinhardt narrowed his eyes. "What is this?" he asked, snatching the metal folder from the table. Klaus didn't move. "Proof." The officer flipped through the first few pages. His expression didn't change, but he kept reading, slower, then again. He reached the diagram showing 2 nearly identical planes, one modified, one standard. The modified one had returned with light damage after a mission with over 60% flak loss. The standard one had not. He looked up. "You think this matters?" "I know it does," Klaus said. Reinhardt studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, surprisingly, he handed the folder back. I'm not the one you have to convince, he said. But I'll see to it this reaches someone who might care. And just like that, he left. No threats, no arrests, only a door left open and the scent of danger still hanging in the air. That evening, the hangar was quiet again. The men sat together, not working for once, just waiting, uncertain if they'd done something brave or something fatal. Heinrich finally broke the silence. Do you think he believed us? Klaus didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the ceiling, where the B-17's shadow still loomed. Then he said, I think he believed the numbers. And that was enough. For now.